I want to warmly welcome you to today's webinar, which we organize on the occasion of today's launch of the second Done by Into Occupation DBIO report. So yeah, I will not say too much. I just want to say a couple of words about the coalition and the basic rationale for the coalition and our work. And I will then present the speakers to you, and we'll get started. So very briefly about DBIO, we're a coalition of 24 Palestinian and European organizations working in 7 different European countries and in Palestine. So we work in Belgium, Netherlands, France, the UK, Ireland, Spain, and Norway. And I also have 2 Palestinian partners in the coalition, Al-Haq and Palestinian Institute for Public Diplomacy, PYPD. And so the coalition was established in early 2020 with the aim of investigating and highlighting the financial relationships between European financial institutions on the one hand and companies operating in the Israeli settlement industry on the other. So the basic aim of the coalition is to produce an annual report that investigates these financial relationships and have that report annually updated. So today's report is the second such report. So this will serve as a basis for joint advocacy work and campaigning in the months to come. So basically, in order to remind European financial institutions of the risks, but also the consequences of their involvement with the settlement enterprise and their responsibilities under international law, UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. So I would also want to warmly encourage you to go to our website to read the full report, which also includes a foreword by the current chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Fernanda Hoppenheim. So she has written this forward. It's included in the report, which is published on our website. The website also includes a data builder tool, so you can build your own table and find specific data that you're looking for in terms of specific countries, financial institutions, and companies. And so today we have with us 3 speakers who will talk you through the reports a bit more in detail. Unfortunately, the 4th speaker that we're hoping to have, so the head of the big Nabala municipality will not be able to join. So something came in between at the last minute, so we're very sorry about that. But still, I think we have managed to gather extremely good panel with 3 speakers. So first we will have Ines Abdelrazek from PYPD, one of the coalition members, who will present the main findings and the recommendations of this year's report. Second, we have with us Gabriela Chiano, who's an independent business and human rights specialist working with different NGOs and civil society networks on business and human rights issues, and who previously was a senior legal advisor on business and human rights at Amnesty International. And then we have also with us Julia Barbos, who's working as a human rights policy researcher and campaigner at Banktrack, one of the DBIO members, who will talk a bit more in detail about responsibilities of banks against the UN guiding principles of business and human rights. So before we start, a couple of housekeeping rules. As you will have noticed, this event is recorded. So it will be published also on the DBIO website later on. It is also being live streamed on the Facebook page of PYPD, Palestinian Institute for Public Diplomacy. So just that you are aware of that. In terms of the outline, we will have short interventions by the 3 speakers, followed by Q&A with the audience. So please, if you have a question, put it in the chat and we will try to make sure that it is being addressed. Also for the French speakers, we have also provided translation to French. So if you would like that, you can click on the interpreter mode and select French as your language. And yeah, so of course, also a warm call upon everybody, like when typing questions in the chat, to make it as concise and precise as possible. And as always, we try to avoid long statements. So with that being said, I will turn the floor to Ines, who will share a bit more details about this year's report's overall findings and recommendations.
Thank you, Willem. Can you hear me well? Yes. Thank you, Willem, and hello, everybody. It's another occasion, I think, to launch this second report. I think this shows how much also a continuity there is in this coalition. I think it's very important research and work that I think all of the organizations are providing, so that we can hold accountable the private sector, the financial institutions and companies for being involved and complicit with Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity against the Palestinian people. My name is Ines. I'm the advocacy director at the PIPD, and I am speaking with you today from Ramallah. And I was asked to give a bit of an overview of the findings of this of our report and our research. I want to thank very much the authors. Actually, I'm not among the people who actually co-wrote the report. I've been obviously following and helping along the whole year, but definitely kudos to I think all of our colleagues who have provided this in-depth research. The new thing this year that I think we could share with you is that we have provided a way to view the data much more easily, and for you to search the data on the website by company and by creditor. And I think this is really helpful because there is, as the report says, we're looking at 50 companies involved in the settlements. And we're, the research includes 725 financial institutions. So it has found that, 725 financial institutions, European ones, have either, a creditor relationship with the companies involved in the forms of loans and underwritings, or they also have an investor relationship with those companies in the forms of bonds and investments. So this year's report, compared to last year's report, is looking at a span of 3.5 years, but we looked at the overall I think investments and also loans and underwritings between January 2019 and August 2022. So it's the same span as last year's report. Last year's report was looking at between 2018 and 2021, also over 3.5 years. So this year overall, it found that basically during the analyzed period, a total of $171.4 billion was provided in the forms of loans and underwritings, compared to 114 in the past report. And also this year's report looks at, found that there is 115.5 billion in shares and bonds in these companies, when actually the last year's report found more. It was around 141. But we're looking at the same range. That's because most of the companies and financial institutions, unfortunately, are still failing to, basically hold their responsibilities under international law, UN guidelines, and OECD guidelines. I think colleagues will speak more about that. But still very much, it's the same creditors and investors that are on top of that list that are still, again, complicit in being involved in Israeli settlements in the West Bank. So, banks like BNP Paribas, HSBC, Barclays, the German Deutsche Bank, Societe Generale, and same for investors, still the government pension fund of Norway, Crédit Agricole in France, Deutsche Bank are among the largest investors. So in the executive summary of the report, you can find the top list, and unfortunately, it doesn't change much. And along the process of the research, of course, we have been exchanging with those companies, and many of them since last year have completely failed into giving satisfactory answers for their involvement and still their investments in those companies. So just a reminder also on how we have, why those 50 companies. Back in 2013, the UN Human Rights Council had deployed a fact-finding mission in Palestine to look at the settlement enterprise and the involvement of companies, and it had listed a set of listed activities, including, it ranges from providing services to providing materials to exploiting natural resources, harming the environment. All of these different activities where are listed as activities that are making any company listed as involved in the settlements, and a lot of them, not all of them, are listed in then the UN database that then emerged from that fact-finding mission, the UN database of companies involved in Israeli settlements. However, not all companies were listed in that database, unfortunately. So we have taken the scope of those listed activities rather than the database only. The database was issued in 2020. And one of the recommendations of our report is to update that database, because unfortunately, until today, there has been no update of that list. So the report, in terms of findings, also is looking at different case studies. So we provide, a summary of the top companies, who they are, but also we go a bit more in depth into looking at the impact of these companies in several case studies. This year, we looked at companies involved in the construction of the settlements, meaning they provide material for the construction of the settlements. And we look also at the demolitions. And I think this is where also we wanted to have someone to talk about this, because Israel, since especially this year, but also in the past 10 years, has demolished tens of thousands of Palestinian infrastructure, homes, shelters, agriculture infrastructure, all of this with the involvement of companies, and these companies have European, finance. European funders, creditors, and investors. So, especially this year, we have looked at, Masafriyata, because Masafriyata is a region in the south of Hebron, in the South Hebron Hills. It's communities who, unfortunately, the Israeli Supreme Court has greenlighted their basic ethnic cleansing and the forced expulsion of the communities of Masafriyata. And they are constantly under, permanent, demolition of an infrastructure here and there, homes, schools. And we've seen repeatedly the involvement of companies like Volvo, Hyundai, and other machinery providers. And so this is, the ongoing, basically, complicity in that, and Palestinians, what they're asking is basically for these companies to withdraw and to divest and withdraw their complicity and end their complicity. And the third case study we looked at this year is surveillance. More and more, you can also look at the research done by our partners at Hamle, a Palestinian organization. The surveillance sector, there are European financial institutions that are investing in Israeli surveillance providers, notably Elbit System, that provide equipment that are participating to the settlement enterprise in forms of surveilling Palestinians, of providing material for prisons, for control over Palestinians, and that to the profit of Israeli settlements. And other companies that are not Israeli, like Motorola, also have been involved in the provision of material to prisons, etc. So you can look at those case studies in the report. And the report goes again in depth into recommendations, and I won't list them all, but it looks at 3 different duty bearers. One, the financial institutions themselves. The financial institutions still, they have to conduct enhanced human rights due diligence, and they have to put effective pressure and use their leverage for the businesses to withdraw from the activities in the, in their complicity and involvement with settlements, and that's, that is, like, most of them are still failing, and they have to also develop clear guidelines, and obviously all of that, again, most of the financial institutions we're looking at in the report fail to do that. And not only that, financial institutions have a responsibility to engage with Palestinians, with the local stakeholders, affected people, to actually provide effective remedy. Again, until today, I think we're still at the stage where they need to enhance their due diligence and divest from the companies when the company failed themselves to withdraw from the settlements. And so the second set of recommendations is for business enterprises themselves. They need to cease all activities, that's very clear, that are responsible in the systemic violation of Palestinian human rights. This is a responsibility that they have. And again, they should go under also appropriate remedial processes. And then there is the recommendations to governments, because governments and public authorities have a responsibility also. So as I said, update the UN database, but not only. I think it's very important for every European governments to adopt strong, due diligence mechanisms and legislation. We know that such legislation exists in France. However, we look into the report, like companies like Carrefour, who recently signed an agreement with Israeli company, will have and already have their products available in settlements. So here is an example where a company is basically violating their own national law on due diligence. And we also know that there is a directive at the European level under discussion. Unfortunately, there are many interests and many lobbying efforts to also water down and unfortunately, withdraw any strong substance in this law. Especially, we're looking at specific provisions that should be there in terms of conflict affected and high risk areas, and reference to international humanitarian law, etc. So I think this is a dangerous and risky path that we're seeing, that these kind of legislation is being discussed, is being adopted, but with quite weak language and engagement. And so again, it fails for governments to hold accountable the private sector. And the second main recommendation for government is to adopt actually legislation that would prohibit the import-export of any service and product coming from the illegal settlements in occupied territories. So I'll stop there, and then I'm sure we're going to go into further questions in the session of Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Ines. No easy task to summarize and main findings and recommendations, and also touch upon the human element and the daily impact of the settlement enterprise. But you did an excellent job in a little less than 15 minutes. So I'll now turn the floor to Gabriella. So as said in the introduction, Gabriella is an external legal expert, so she's not part of the DBIO coalition. But yeah, the reason why we asked her to provide a contribution to the report and also participate in today's webinar is that, yeah, as this report is the second such report, so following the DBIO 1 report that was published in September 2021. So in our interactions with financial institutions ever since, we came across quite often the same kind of counter arguments offered by financial institutions as a reason why they couldn't do more or weren't doing more. So what we then did is asking Gabriella to provide an expert analysis on some of these commonly heard counter arguments. So I very much encourage you to read them all in full in the report. So it's included as a separate subsection 4.3 in the report, where we asked Gabriella to provide her analysis of 5 such frequently heard counter arguments. For the sake of time, Gabriella will today focus in her intervention on 3 of these arguments. So regarding the question as to whether ESG ratings do pay sufficient focus to human rights violations. Also, she will talk a bit more about the frequently heard counter argument about dual use. And last but not least, she will also touch upon the fact that financial institutions often claim that the investment they may have in a particular business that only entails like a very small part of their portfolio in that business, and that therefore they shouldn't be held accountable for the whole relationship. But yeah, I will turn the floor to Gabriella, who will talk more in depth, and of course, feel free to, in the Q&A afterwards, ask her directly more questions. Over to you, Gabriella.
Thank you, Willem. Thank you very much for the introduction. And I've got a little bit more time because you went over the questions that I was hoping that I was going to introduce, the arguments that I wanted to address, and you covered them. So yeah, the idea with my presentation is just to focus very specifically on some of the typical arguments that financial institutions make, so that we don't talk about the corporate responsibility to respect and financial institutions' responsibility to respect more generally, but we focus in on what are the typical answers that that we receive and address those and why they are not valid or legitimate. So specifically on the ESG arguments, what we typically hear is that financial institutions rely on ESG ratings of the companies that they invest in or that they loan to, and they feel that that is sufficient to cover their due diligence and screening responsibilities, and that is sufficient guarantee that they're doing a responsible investment. And what I would say in relation to that is that ESG frameworks and ESG methodologies, which are then what ESG rating agencies and ESG advisors then use to rate companies, doesn't cover all risks to human rights. There isn't a total alignment between ESG ratings and matrix and the UNGPs and the responsibility to respect human rights, and many risks to human rights are often disregarded or undervalued in ESG ratings. ESG data providers are still overwhelmingly concerned with value creation and materiality, and that is not in alignment with the expectation to respect human rights and human rights responsibilities of businesses, which are independent from questions of materiality. So to the extent that data providers, ESG data providers still predominantly are guided by value creation and concepts of materiality, they will often overlook and miss important human rights risks. So what this means is that a company could have a very high or a high ESG rating and still be involved in human rights abuses and be causing or contributing human rights abuses. And financial institutions need to understand this. And any claim of a financial institution that they are not contributing or that they are not linked to human rights abuses based on ESG data and BSG ratings alone is therefore unreliable, and it could be untrue. As far as the dual use argument that is so often raised by financial institutions, again, first of all, I think it's important to make a differentiation. There are certain products, certain activities that are inherently risky. They, by their very nature, pose risks to human rights, and I would say, for instance, pesticides and weapons. But there are others that, by themselves, they are not risky. They are not they're legitimate, law-abiding, human rights compliant activities or products, but where they may become a risk to human rights is the way in which they are used. And financial institutions and companies need to look at both types of risks, or basically where the risk to human rights emerge. Is it because of the inherent qualities and attributes of the product itself, or is it because of the risk that the product itself may be put to a human rights incompatible use? And so the dual use argument is not a legitimate argument. And what financial institutions need to do is they need to condition their investment or their finance on clients putting credible systems in place to prevent the misuse of their products, particularly if they provide these products to high-risk individuals or high-risk governments or in high-risk regions. And just to give an example, bulldozers are a totally legitimate and law-abiding product, and is generally put to a good use and a human rights respecting use. But in the context of the Israeli settlements in the OPT, we know very well, and companies know or should know very well, that they are often used to go ahead with illegal demolitions, which by the fact that by the way they also amount to crimes under international law. So in that context, it is not legitimate to say that a bulldozer doesn't actually raise massive red flags, and because it could be used to engage in demolitions that are illegal under international law. So that's another typical argument that we hear that is not legitimate in general, but particularly in the context of the OPT and the illegal Israeli settlements. I just wanted to quote a statement by the OHCHR when addressing this issue, and it advised the company in its interpretive guidance on the responsibility to respect of the UNGPs when they say that companies must remain vigilant for possible shifts in risk patterns, such as when long-standing products or services start to be used for unintended purposes. So that leaves this very clear. To move on quickly to the other argument that financial institutions raise, that the size of the lending or the size of the investment is small, and therefore they should not be called on to act in relation to the investee companies or clients. The UNGPs and the OECD guidelines on multinational enterprises don't make a differentiation, and in fact they are very clear that financial institutions have a responsibility to respect human rights and to seek to prevent or mitigate adverse impacts in relation to all companies they loan to or all companies that they are invested in, regardless of the proportion of their lending or of their holding. And both the OHCHR and the OECD have commented on this issue and have made it very clear that the size of their investment and the size of their lending is inconsequential. And in the section that Willem referred to in the report, I give the links to the specific statements and guidance provided by these two authoritative entities. The only way in which the size of the lending and the size of the holding might have consequences in the extent of leverage that a financial institution may have. But that is not an excuse not to take action. What financial institutions in this position need to do is seek to increase their leverage, which could be, for instance, by working with other lenders and other investors to increase leverage. and therefore the possibility to change the behavior of the investee company or the company receiving a loan. And again, if leverage cannot be increased, then the financial institution needs to reconsider what their investment or withdraw their credit as a second option. And finally, I will just address one other argument that is also typically raised by financial institutions, and William didn't mention, but it's just very easily addressed, although very frequently raised, which is the fact that the investee companies or companies receiving loans from companies are generally engaged in legitimate, law-abiding activities, and the size of the proportion of their controversial or activities that may impact on human rights is very small in comparison. And therefore, the investment is still legitimate and still go ahead, and there's no reason to divest. And again, that is not a valid argument. And the UNGPs and John Ruggie, when he drafted the UNGPs, made that amply clear that the positive impacts in one area of activity of a company does not offset the negative impacts that this company may be having elsewhere. So, and this applies equally to financial institutions. So the fact that the majority or a large proportion of the activities of clients or investee companies is legal and legitimate and brings about positive impacts, it does not justify a financial institution not taking action in relation to activities that do cause or contribute to adverse impacts, even if these constitute a very small or a small minority fraction of the overall activities of the investee company. So I will, there are a few other arguments that financial institutions typically raise and raised in their responses to the campaign, but I will leave them for now for the sake of time, and you can read the specific chapter in the report to look at those as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Gabriela. And yeah, encourage everybody very much to read in full Gabriela's expert analysis included in the report. So last but not least, I'll turn the floor to Julia, who's one of the co-authors of Banktrack's Global Human Rights Benchmark 2022 report. So in the next 10 minutes, Julia will talk us through some of the key findings of this report, and also zooms in on the question on how this is relevant and touches upon the specific situation of settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Willem. Just trying to sort my screen. I hope I have a few slides to share with you today. I hope you can see them. Can you see them? That's great. So yeah, first of all, thank you so much to Ines, Gabriela, for introducing the report's findings, and also for the thoughtful points already raised. And yeah, and thank you also for having me today with you on this panel. As already mentioned, my name is Julia Barbus. I'm the human rights researcher and campaigner at Banktrack. And Banktrack is a Netherlands-based member of the Don't Buy Into Occupation Coalition. Today, I thought I would share with you briefly some of the findings of Banktrack's recently launched Global Human Rights benchmark, which provides an additional layer of information on how some of the commercial banks that are also included in the DBIO report are doing when it comes to human rights. Can I change the... Yeah, I can. Sorry, apologies. So to give you a little bit of background, the Global Human Rights Benchmark is this year in its fourth iteration, and it assesses 50 of the world's largest banks on their implementation of the UN guiding principles on business and human rights on a set of 14 criteria, which are divided in 4 categories. And they look at banks' human rights policies, their processes for human rights due diligence, their reporting on human rights, and lastly, on their approaches to remedy, including grievance mechanisms. This year, we introduced an additional category which assesses banks on their responses to human rights allegations that were raised by affected communities and their representatives. So based on their final scores, which are calculated out of 14, based on category 1 to 4, banks are ranked as laggards, from laggards to leaders, according from lowest scoring to highest scoring. And then the results for the 5th category on response tracking are then assessed separately. Some of the key findings of this year's report is that none of the banks researched yet show an adequate implementation of the UN guiding principles. So for instance, 38 out of the 50 banks in scope achieved only a score of less than 7 points out of 14, indicating that they're implementing less than half of the responsibilities under the UNGPs. This is problematic, not only because the UNGPs outline a minimum expected behavior of standards expected from companies, but also because it's been already 11 years since basically their unanimous adoption. So it's been quite a while. Our report also finds that there are no leaders, meaning that no bank achieved a score of more than 9 points out of 14. However, there have also been some improvements. So for example, banks on average scored 5 points out of 14 versus only 4 out of 14 in 2019. And more specifically, banks have largely got human rights statements of policies in place and have strengthened their approach to human rights due diligence. However, these achievements remain very small and very slow. So here, for instance, you can see all the different criteria that are assessed in our benchmark, and we can see that banks generally scored better on the top of the chart. So that's, under policies and human rights due diligence processes. But we can also see that when it comes to reporting and remediation, there are glaring gaps. And so banks are still lagging behind on disclosing their human rights impacts and steps taken to address these, and also committing to provide for, cooperate in remediation. Of the 50 banks that we considered in our benchmark, 21 were also included in the Don't Buy Into Occupation report, which we're launching here today. This includes banks such as Dutch ABN AMRO, Rabobank and ING Group, Spanish BBVA, German Deutsche Bank, French BNP Paribas, and British Standard Chartered and Barclays, all of which, as you can see here, highlighted in green, were ranked as front runners on our benchmark, meaning that they scored 7 points or more over 14, and are among the better performing banks when it comes to implementing human rights responsibilities. Despite this, some of the banks scoring highest are also some of the banks found to be providing the most finance to companies involved in the occupied Palestinian territory. So for example, BNP Paribas, Société Générale, Barclays, and Deutsche Bank are among the top 5 creditors out of all 725 European institutions, financial institutions analyzed in the Don't Buy Into Occupation report. So this is quite a worrying finding. Also, as part of the benchmark, we have analyzed the responses of banks to specific human rights violations. So 47 banks out of 50 were contacted 152 times on 13 specific allegations. Of these 47 banks, 10 were assessed specifically in terms of their responses to the findings of the first Don't Buy Into Occupation report, which was published last year in September. Our findings show that banks are evasive when challenged on specific human rights violations, and especially when it comes to finance provided to companies that are involved in the occupied Palestinian territory. Out of these 10 banks, only 4 responded, and these are Crédit Agricole, HSBC, Lloyds Banking Group, and Standard Chartered. But when it comes to the substance of the responses, 3 of them cited client confidentiality, and only 1, Standard Chartered, responded publicly, but without acknowledging the link to the impact. In its response, Standard Chartered provided evidence that had reviewed its management systems in order to provide further impact from happening in the future. But it didn't, for instance, provide any details on how it monitored the progress of the companies or of the actual impact, if it was being remedied or not on rights holders on the ground. We have also engaged BNP Paribas on this topic, including by submitting a formal question to their annual general meeting. And despite the bank having a record of being one of the better ones at engaging on human rights issues with stakeholders, on this particular issue, the bank did not really speak to the subject matter and simply said that they consider the issue seriously and that they apply their code of conduct and engagement policies rigorously. So, very evasive answer. In addition, also as part of our research for the benchmark, we looked at whether banks had a policy explicitly excluding involvement with illegal settlements in occupied territories. And we found that no bank had such a policy in place. And no bank explicitly mentioned the term occupied territories. And for example, their human rights statements or in ESG frameworks. In 2016, ABN AMRO included language around expecting clients to respect international humanitarian law and human rights, for instance, by not enabling settlements in occupied territories, but this mention has since been removed. So just to wrap up, what this shows is that this issue is not getting the attention it deserves. Many financial institutions, and including banks, are talking the talk when it comes to human rights, but are not really walking the walk. This shows not only through our benchmarks findings, but also in our engagement with banks, which consistently hide behind client confidentiality when it comes to this human rights issue in particular, but also other human rights issues. And so there is need for financial institutions and banks to overcome this barrier, to show that they understand their responsibilities and that they're willing to play a role when it comes to addressing impacts and providing remedy. Addressing impacts and providing remedy are key gaps that we urgently need to see addressed. And at the heart of both of them is meaningful rights holders consultation. In our benchmark report, we call on banks to enhance rights holder consultation, as human rights due diligence can only be effective if those who are most affected are consulted with. And this is obviously all the more important when it comes to complex situations. And even if it might prove challenging, this is the single most important step to ensure that any further action on the side of the financial institution is informed by local realities and experiences. And this is also true if this is to result in responsible disengagement. Lastly, consulting with affected communities is also essential if a financial institution is to provide effective remedy. So there is an increased need not only for companies, but also for financial institutions, banks, investors, and others to play a more active role when it comes to remediation of harms. And this includes developing own grievance channel and grievance mechanisms for those affected to seek remedy. And I think I will end it here, as I believe I might have run over time, but thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A session. Back to Willem.
Thanks a lot, Julia. Could you maybe turn on? Yeah, thanks. So yeah, that concludes the three interventions of our speakers. So we have now about 10 minutes left for Q&A with the audience. So as mentioned earlier, if you have a question for one of the speakers, please do write it down directly in the chat, and also mention to whom the question is addressed. We have already one question from Sean, which is basically about the question: why are diamond companies that fund the occupation why aren't they mentioned in this report? So I can answer that one. So as mentioned by Ines in her intervention, in terms of our methodology, what we did is basically in the report we do like the research has two phases. So in the first phase, we put together a list of companies, and the second, we look at the financial relationships between these companies and financial institutions. So in order to get to the first step, this company list, we built upon the existing UN database of settlement companies, and basically the criteria for inclusion in that database. And these are 10 so-called listed categories that were set out in the relevant resolution from March 2016 by the UN Human Rights Council, establishing this UN database. And so these are 10 categories. So for example, a category around involvement in the construction of settlements, another on supplying equipment for the demolition of Palestinian houses, being involved in the exploitation of natural resources, and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, specific references to diamonds were not there. So that's, I guess, explains why. Are there any other questions from the audience? Please don't be shy. Or Gabriela, go ahead.
So I have, there's a question that's been asked about examples of financial institutions that have teamed up together in order to increase leverage. And I don't dare actually give an example, just because I'm a little bit reluctant to do so, just because I don't claim to have an exhaustive knowledge of actions taken by financial institutions, and it could be that there are good examples out there, but what I would say is actually the fact that these are difficult to come across is because there's a massive amount of confidentiality, and either confidentiality, and if financial institutions are doing anything at all, we just don't know it. And the fact that so few financial institutions respond to the communications from the campaign is a reflection of how confidential this is being treated. But it could also be, and I suspect that it is also, that many or a big majority of financial institutions are not doing anything at all, so they have nothing to say. So that is why it's difficult to come up with examples of best practice where financial institutions are doing something to increase their leverage, then either not doing anything, or if they're doing anything at all, they're not reporting on it. And that's one of the difficulties of this campaign, is how little response one gets from financial institutions. So just because we're running out of time, I wanted to also make a broader reflection, which is that the sort of answers that we are getting from financial institutions are so basic, and I would almost say easy to address, that it's frustrating. To still hear financial institutions raising the dual use argument to say why they feel that they shouldn't divest, and there's nothing for them to do because the product that the company that they invest in is a legitimate product, generally used for a good purpose. It's not an argument that financial institutions that are legitimately engaged with these issues should be raising today. We know that the problem with many products is not their product itself, but the use to which it is put, especially if you sell it to certain governments, or you sell it to certain regimes. So you trade in that product in certain regions. So what my plea to financial institutions is to stop making that sort of argument that only delays the conversation and doesn't get the conversation into, it doesn't turn the conversation into a meaningful exchange where real solutions can be discussed I would say the same in relation to the proportion of the lending and the proportion on the investment financial institutions, now through the OECD guidance and through the UNGPs and plenty of advice from OHCHR that the proportion of lending and the proportion of shareholding is not an excuse not to take action. So hopefully in the third iteration of this report, financial institutions will become more meaningful in their answers, both responding, but also in what they say and what their arguments are. Let's just hope.
Thanks a lot, Gabriela, for this important words and powerful call to action. So I do hope that some representatives of financial institutions that are in the Zoom room have listened very carefully. So yeah, we still have 5 minutes. Yes, go ahead.
Can I just make something quick about the impact? Because I think from again, a non, I'm not really a lawyer or someone involved directly in corporate responsibility. I'm in the West Bank, and I think often the response we see from companies, I think the case that happened with Booking.com this year was, I think, very telling, is often people forget what actual Israeli settlements do to Palestinians. I think they are trying to hide away behind the, some argument that this would be complicated, that this would be a conflict area. And so they somehow, take this as a very remote and very cold issue when the impact is very real and it's getting worse and worse. I mean, there is the most fascist government in Israel right now that is, not only de facto annexing the West Bank, but looking at de jure annexation. The Palestinian, the demolition of Palestinian homes and infrastructure has increased. Settler violence has been tremendously increasing, and there is attacks by settlers, every week. I think it's important to look at these impacts because it's really driving Palestinians away. It's also really contributing to the apartheid regime, which is the segregation and the isolation of Palestinians. Is also worsening because these companies and these financial institutions are contributing to the Bantustanization of Palestinians. We are in cities where we are surrounded by checkpoints, by settlements, by basically a military regime that also has all sovereignty inside or outside our cities. And I think it's very important for them not to, not to look away. And I think it's often what we can see from companies just putting some general disclaimers like Booking.com does, both for Palestinian hotels and listings in illegal Israeli settlements. They just put this disclaimer that, this is a conflict affected area, just make your choice. I think that's very weak, a very weak response, and it's also failing in their responsibilities. And on the other hand, I think what we didn't mention is there are cases. So there are companies and financial institutions that have divested. So if we look at in the report, we mentioned a few of them, like the ABP, Netherlands pension fund, KLP, a Norwegian pension fund, are two financial institutions that have divested not only from Palestine, but other places where clearly they saw that there's a very high risk that they're contributing to human rights violations. And companies like I think Salisbury that has decided to Pillsbury products, they have decided to remove their factory from Atarot settlements. So I think it's possible, and I think again they cannot hide away behind the fact that this is impossible, because when there is a will, there's a way.
Thanks, Ines. Okay, so we have 3 questions, so please bear with me for a couple more minutes. So the first question is from Maria, so asking about whether DBIO also engages governments to push private companies to change their policies. So the short answer is yes, we do that. So as said, we're a coalition of 24 organizations, including 2 Palestinian partners, but then the other coalition members are European organizations that are operating in 7 different European countries. So in terms of our advocacy, we like the follow-up advocacy that we do after each year's report that happens in a rather decentralized way, in which Belgian colleagues are talking to the Belgian government, Dutch colleagues to the Dutch, and so on and so forth. I think I can maybe also speak for myself, being Brussels-based and Belgian, and having had interactions on this with, for example, the Belgian government, where there are some promising developments, and where, for example, the Belgian Minister of Economy recently announced that he has commissioned a study to, as a report to study the possibility of actually sanctioning sanctioning companies that are on the UN database. So I think this is, of course, a very promising development. There are many more, but yeah, so in short, we do engage governments. Also, the report's set of recommendations, as mentioned by Ines, includes a whole bunch of recommendations directly addressed to European governments. Then we have a question from Jeff. So I guess that's maybe something that Gabriela can answer. I don't know if you can see it, but it's basically, so Jeff is basically asking, Volvo, Hyundai were mentioned as involved companies. In which way are they supporting illegal actions? Because it isn't illegal to buy and use products of them and use them in illegal actions. So I guess, Gabriela, you partially answered that, but maybe you want to make it a bit more specific for like companies such as Volvo, Caterpillar involved in demolitions.
Sorry, Willem, I can't see that question, so I didn't quite understand. I'm seeing another one from Itatso, I think.
Yeah, please take that first one.
Okay, I can see the other one now. It's just coming back. Just very quickly on, there's a question regarding whether there is a possibility to address these issues in the EU Sustainability Corporate Due Diligence Directive, and I say absolutely and definitely, and it should. I think the problem is that the issue of whether financial institutions are covered by this draft legislation or not is one of the hot topics at the moment, and there is already financial institutions are included in a very caveated and restricted manner in terms of what financial institutions are covered and what is the extent of their responsibilities. And there's a massive push at the moment to even remove financial institutions altogether from the law. So it is one of the most controversial and contested issues at the moment, but it definitely should be addressed in any adequate and effective due diligence legislation in EU and anywhere else. Yes, that's what I would say in relation to that. And then maybe if you move on to another question, I'll just spend a little bit of time reading the next one.
Thanks, Gabriela. I don't think that there are actually other questions. So if you want to quickly address, I think you partially already answered it in your intervention, but maybe you want to talk more specifics about demolitions.
Okay, I haven't looked specifically into Volvo and Hyundai, and maybe that's something, if they are mentioned in the report, somebody else could mention. But if I understand the question correctly, if basically there are attempts in the EU, and but especially in Ireland, to pass legislation that would ban the import of products coming from the illegal Israeli settlements. That legislation would make these products illegal in Ireland, and if and any other state that pass similar legislation. So those products may not be illegal, but what the campaign under the international framework on business and human rights alleges is that buying products that come from the settlements, or in any way being participant in the supply chain of those products, is not compatible with the normative framework on business and human rights, because by virtue of buying products or supplying to the settlements or buying products from the settlements, businesses are contributing to the economy of the settlements and therefore to their viability, to their expansion. and to their growth. So I'm not really sure whether that answers directly the question that is being raised, but that's one issue that I'd like to say in response. That there are attempts to making products coming from the settlements illegal as well under national legislation, and Ireland is a very good example of that.
Thanks a lot, Gabriela. And yeah, on that positive note, I think we will have to wrap up because it's already 3:05. So yeah, again, thanks a lot to all the three speakers for being with us today. Thanks a lot also to everybody who participated today for making the time. And yeah, as said, please visit our DBIO website and read the report in full. And of course, if you have any follow-up questions, also don't hesitate to get in touch with us through the contact info listed on the website. So thanks a lot again, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and see you hopefully at another DBIO event in the future.
Thanks, Willem. Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.